everyone. You are listening to The Wellness Project. I'm your host, Des, and this is episode number 118. On today's episode, I speak with Benoit Kim about how he's had a shift in his mindset, a shift in his perspective, and a big change in how he lives his life after a few close encounters with death. Benoit explains that he and so many others live reactively, passively, unintentionally, and unmindfully. After his near-death experiences, this changed everything. He realized that he wanted to live life intentionally and live a life with meaning and purpose. I think Benoit's right. I think a lot of us go through our days on autopilot, living unintentionally, going through the motions, getting through each day, and not fully being present and not enjoying the moment that we're in, the day that we're in. We're always moving to the next thing. We're always thinking about the past, thinking about the future. If you're looking for a way to live life more intentionally, then you're definitely going to enjoy this conversation that I have with Benoit. Help me welcome him. All right, everyone. I am here with Benoit Kim. Benoit, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Very excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today because I haven't had anybody on the podcast thus far talk about their near-death experiences. And you haven't had one or two, you've had three. Is that right?
As the common saying goes, third time's a charm. So hopefully I will be capped at 3 near death and nothing more, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, let's hope so. And so, from what I understand, you've told me a little bit that we'll get into for our listeners to hear, but this has had a profound impact on your life and you've had a big journey with your mental health. So, I'd love to get us started. If you could introduce yourself to our listeners and talk about your mental health journey as well as those 3 near-death experiences.
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, my name is Benoit Kim. I am a former policymaker turned psychotherapist and the host of the Discover More podcast, a show for introspective listeners and thinkers with growth mindset. So, the reason why I think a near death experience is so unique, because I think all of us have what we call small t, big T, like trauma, since the language around trauma is very sensitive and many of us tend to minimize our experiences through a comparison, which is not very helpful. At the same time, a lot of us are only aware of this phenomenon called post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. I'm a veteran, so PTSD is very near and dear to my heart. Another phenomenon that many of us don't really know about is called post-traumatic growth. That's the willingness and the humility and the initiative to integrate the insights from what we call traumatic experiences. And through this integration work, a lot of profound insights can be happen and applied on the other side. And that's what happened with my near-death experiences. So as a veteran in 2017, there was a very high tension situations between the United States of Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un at the time in North Korea. I'm not sure if any listeners remember in 2017. And my unit was one of the few units to be summoned to go to the North and South Korean border to support the US troops in light of this high tension escalation situations between the North Korea and the United States. And of course, fortunately, the deployment was canceled last minute because of the escalation cost. And the situation was, thank God, was de-escalated at the very last minute. But I was in my early 20s then, and that was the first time I really had to contemplate my mortality. It was the first time that I realized I may die. And it was the first time that I realized, as an Asian Korean American who brought up under this mindset and this prism, that perseverance and work ethics and grit and achievements will always prevail until they didn't. I had to take a leave of absence for my studies at University of Pennsylvania, the #1 education program in the country at the time for policymaking. I had to depart from my meticulous 3, 5, 7 year plan because of this deployment situations. And that's when I experienced my utter darkness. That's when I had to first accept and reconcile with this truth that mental health is real. And this depression that people talked about is real. It's not something that we can just shrug it off or sleep on it or not talk about it or just get through it. That doesn't really work when you've reached your limits, and all of us have different limits. But yeah, that's the first near-death experiences that I want to share. And of course, there's 2 more that happened after the fact. One is related to alcohol when I was jumped and almost got stabbed in downtown Philadelphia. when I was about 26, and then the most recent with a total car crash where I was the second car out of the five car collisions on Highway 76 in Philadelphia, which was my previous area of residency before I moved to LA. And the only reason why I survived that car crash was because I had a spare tire in my trunk that absorbed about 95% of the impact with this five car collision. Everyone was amazed that I walked away alive, even though I was in intensive chiropractic therapy for about 4 months after that, 3 times a week. But yeah, these are the experiences that I think catalyzed a lot of my deep passion in mental health. And I could share more about the profound insights that shaped and reshaped my worldview and how I navigate mental health, emotional functioning, and what really these peak performance means to me personally.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. And these experiences are so scary and terrifying, and especially that you might not have walked away from that car accident and getting jumped. I mean, these are terrifying things. Did these near-death experiences impact your mental health in any sort of way or any significant way?
Absolutely. If there is a word higher than absolutely, I'll say that word. So I think in hindsight, right, in retrospect view, as I said, through the lens of post-traumatic growth, I attribute immense gratitude to where I am in life, both interpersonally, relationally, or professionally, into these experiences. And what I mean by that is I could no longer live in this world through this very reactive, passive, unintentional, unmindful way of life where a lot of us do live within. And a lot of times it's not their fault. It might be due to lack of informations, lack of cultivated practices, or everything in between. Because as I said, I almost died 3 times. And because of these experiences, I view what I have now as a complete add on. Therefore, I am hyper intentional to the way I navigate this container of life. I am hyper intentional with who I interact with, who I choose to cross path with, not just to be self-serving of my time, but all of us have this opportunity cost, and all of us have this very finite amount of energies and time that we have at our disposal. So because of that, I really got into this mental health and what it really means and what can I do with this new set of informations and insights. And for me, it's that I do not take my health, whether that's mental health, emotional health, or physical health, for granted. And a lot of us in America view physical health and mental health as two separate entities. That's a fallacy. They are two sides of the same coin. Because when you're dealing with relational stress, it impacts how you show up. When you're dealing with mental health stress, it impacts your physical health. So for me, I just view everything through this one collective lens where I never compromise my sleep anymore. I never compromise my physical health anymore because I know that I could be climbing up the best ladder, air quotes, whether that's career wise or whatever accolades I'm chasing after, but that my life and what I have can be taken away at a split second. And these are not just words, these are reflections from my 3 near death experiences that many people don't have. And hopefully, many people won't have. Because I've had that, I really believe that I have to take care of my health because that's the only way for me to show up in those people that I love. And then, in addition to just a career or this ambition track I've been on for the last better half the decade, because I know what is mine will not always be mine. And therefore, what can I do day to day in the present is by showing up to those I love. And that requires me to fulfill my own emotional and mental health capacity.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense given the experiences that you've had. Like you mentioned, I think a lot of people do take that time for granted and do take their lives for granted. And like you said, there is this finite amount of time. We're all going to die at some point, but it's something that many people don't think about, whether it's because they don't want to, or I know a lot of people are scared of death, and maybe a lot of people don't even realize the amount of time that we spend wasted. So I like that you said that you don't take it for granted and you do live intentionally. What does that look like? How does it look like to live intentionally and realize that time is a gift, but it is running out?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I just want to share what popped in my brain. I'm very esoteric and spiritual by nature. And Nietzsche, a great philosopher who declared God is dead in light of the rise of nihilism, he talks about how like when we're born, we signed two contracts with life, and there's only two sub clauses on that contract. One is that there will be pain in this reality that we reside within, and B, we are all going to die. So those are the only two certainties we're born with amidst this reality of uncertainties. I share that because I think it's funny, as you said beautifully, that a lot of us are afraid of dying. A lot of us want to avoid and escape from pain. But I think pain is inheriting characteristics of what we call life. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, I think being intentional is probably the $1 million questions, and that intention looks different to everyone. But to me, having an intentional way of life, being intentional while navigating this complexity of life is based on my own internal metrics. So for me, that means that whoever I'm spending time with, for example, like today, I had a long day, but I chose to be on this show because you're gracious enough to get back to me, and I anticipated a great conversations where we can hopefully provide values. So I view that as that's an hour that I've achieved this full body yes. What that means is my brain intellectually said yes, my heart said yes, and my gut said yes. So when I have this full body yes moment, I view that as, oh, it aligns with my intentionality of what I want to do in this moment for this hour. And that's an example for tonight. Or when I'm having a meal or quality time or active services with my friends or with people who I've been caught up in a while, because we're all caught up in the motions of life. I really am deliberate and intentional about what do I want to achieve for that hangout session with a friend. And I don't mean by deriving or what can we get out of each other, but what I mean by it is what am I hopefully providing and contributing to that conversation to this person that I love, that I don't get to see each other for another few months because of our schedules. And what can I show up for that? And for me to show up optimally, just like tonight's conversations, I would either meditate or do an intentional setting to remind myself of the intentions or the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. And whether it's with you or with my friends, but those are some of the examples that I want to share based on my own internal metrics, which is how can I show up to the best version of myself in whatever containers I'm in based on the intention that I set beforehand.
Oh, I really like that. Thank you for sharing that. I love this idea of living within your values and living intentionally. And I feel like a lot of people do live outside of their values. They're working jobs that they hate. Maybe they're in a relationship that they're not fully invested in. Maybe they're spending time with people that kind of drain them instead of energize them and add to their lives. I feel like so many people are not living with intention and living outside of their values. What do you have to say to people that want to be more in tune with their values and live within their values? Because I just think that is a struggle for a lot of people for one reason or another. I think a part of it is boundaries. Maybe people don't really exactly know what their values are. Maybe people don't feel like they can live within their values for whatever reason. So, do you have any advice or any guidance on how people can live more intentionally within their value system?
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question. So I just want to preface by saying that I'm not attached to anything that I share. So it's definitely not advice by any means, but just some of my own thoughts. Once again, I think the other way of looking at your question is how can we be more in tune with our intuitions, what I call intuitive whispers by Mass Kip. And what that means is I think all of us are spiritual beings and all of us are intuitive beings. Like when you're young, we know a lot of these incidents about infants or babies escaping some very dangerous situations unknowingly or just being so in the flow because they're almost like an empty canvas, right? They're not diluted, they're not tainted, they're pure. All of us have that same level of intuitions within us, whether you call it the animalistic instinct or otherwise. I call it intuition. It comes down to can you trust yourself? Because that's how I view confidence is self-confidence is do you believe and trust in your ability to execute what you said you would? And a layer deeper is if you can't trust your words, if you can't trust what you said you would, then how can you possibly trust your intuition? I share that because for those who are afraid of trusting themselves, or for those people who aren't unable to trust themselves due to the patterns, due to some of the data points they have, whatever the reasons or circumstances may be, because circumstances at times are larger than what we are, what we could perceived to be. I think it comes down to evaluating and reviewing the archive of your behaviors and patterns. Is what sort of a data points and evidence do you have that you can trust your intuition, this gut feeling that you have? Because a lot of us are like, oh, just trust your gut feeling. I think that's a very general blanket advice where some people should trust their gut more. And I think some people should trust their gut less. And I hate the word should, but I'm using this very intentionally in this context. Because, as you said, if you have a lot of evidence in your life based on evaluations of your archive of your behaviors and patterns, the more you have data points and evidence that suggests that you could trust what you're about to do, I think it makes sense to just go with that feeling. Just like with myself or you or someone with a cultivated heightened self-awareness or discipline, etc. Before those who can't have that, archive or have that database of evidence that supports that they could trust themselves, I think that's when they need to lean on to external systems like a circle of trustees that can really stress test them and provide them with maximum constructive values with the intentions of bettering them. But I think those relationships and these circles of trust are even more and more rare nowadays because everyone's busy. But yeah, to summarize your question, I think it comes down to, can you trust yourself? A, and B, if you can't trust yourself or your words, why is that? What are some of the evidence that suggests that or otherwise? And you can sort of go down this ladder of inquiries and questions.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. And something that this reminds me of something else I've heard, that it's so important for us to keep our promises to ourselves. If we say, for example, that we have a goal, like say that you really value health or your mental health. And so your goal is that you want to go to the gym and then you keep not going to the gym. That kind of teaches us that we're not trustworthy and that maybe we aren't maybe even worthy of living within our values. So I've heard that come up quite a bit recently, that it's so important for us to keep our promises to ourselves because we don't want to view ourselves as somebody that's not trustworthy and that we lie to ourselves. So that just kind of reminded me that of that. That's kind of like a parallel to the point that you made.
Yeah, and just to go even layer deeper, I'm a huge nerd on neurobiology and neuroscience, but this is a very, very simple concept called neural pathways. I'm sure many of your listeners may be familiar with this term, but for this or not, neural pathways are simply the pathways that are within your neural circuits in your brain. And a good way to look at that is neural pathways are the foundations for all habit building. Imagine there's a trail in the mountains. And if there's no one has gone that path before you, it's a very treacherous and very dangerous trail because there's not a path. But then the more people and more bikers go down through that path, over time, it creates a concrete and tangible pathway. And so it's safer and easier to go down that path without danger necessarily. That's what neural pathways are. So, yes, the more they not fulfill their promises in their words, it does create this dissonance that, oh, I cannot trust myself when I really need to trust myself. Because if we don't trust ourselves, how can we expect other people to trust ourselves? They're just not realistic and doesn't make any sense. But on a neurobiological level, by not doing what you said you would, you're priming your brain literally on a neurological level, and you're establishing neural pathways that allows you to have this circuits that actually this allows you to do what you want to do. So you're like, oh, I want to come home and after work at 5 p.m., I want to read for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But then you get home, the first thing you do is turn the TV and go to Netflix or whatever that you do. You're creating the neural pathways that, oh, when I get home, I'm going to turn the Netflix for the 30 minutes versus, oh, when I get home, I'm going to read the book for 10 minutes. The neural pathways for reading has not been established. Instead, you're contributing to this unhealthy or maybe less aligned and less intentional neural pathways of Netflix or something else that was not your intention. So neurologically, there is actual physiological and psychophysiological impact of our actions on our brains and everything in between.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for explaining that. That's so interesting and I think really helpful for people to know. And I'm definitely one of those people that I'm like, oh, I'm going to read every night before bed for 30 minutes. And I never do. And I always get upset with myself. So I'm glad that you explained that so I could kind of reframe that and kind of change the things I'm saying to myself in a way.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not demonizing Netflix. I love Netflix myself. But like I said, that's why having intentionality and having this intentional lifestyle really matters, both mentally, emotionally, neurologically, because like we are often what we say we do, period. So that's why it's very important to align our actions with our words. Of course, that's very trope of for me to say that, but obviously all tropes have withstood the iterations of time for many eons. So we know that there's a lot of truth in these cliches that survived. But yeah, we are what we say we do. So it's important that A, we're intentional about what we say, and B, we're intentional about what we do based on what we said. It's not just about the other people, but often like, can you trust yourself? Because you're gonna need that self-trust, which translates to confidence, self-esteem, and many more.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's really great. And I'd love to switch gears a little bit. I know that you mentioned that you kind of came to a point where you really believed in mental health and you had this whole other life before you became a therapist. So I'd love to hear about that, how you came to a head with your mental health, how you really started believing that mental health was real, it was a real condition, it is tied in to physical health, and how you became a therapist.
Yeah, so my career that I was very, driven and passionate about before psychotherapy was policy making. As I said, I went to one of the best policy schools in the world at UPenn for policy making, because I think there's many different avenues and vehicles for change. Whether you're a physician, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a therapist, you get to help maybe hundreds of people a year, which is amazing because when you heal someone, you provide healing for their families. So healing is a ripple effect. It's not isolated. It's actually collective. At the same time, as a policymaker, with the sign of a bill, with some policymaking processes, with nonprofits or whatever, you get to impact hundreds and thousands of people every single year, or even shorter than that. So I still believe after, even though I pivoted after I got jaded in politics and policy, I still believe that policymaking is one of the most effective vehicle for change. At the same time, the macro is compressed in the micro. And I realized a lot of these societal issues I was deeply passionate about were byproduct or reflections of unattended mental health, intergenerational trauma, poverty, or some combination thereof. And also in addition to some gory details that this is not the place to share because it might be a 6 hour podcast. I had to reconcile with this uncomfortable truth that I want to work with a micro, which is mental health. So of course I took that pivot. Like I said, I think my understanding for mental health is ever evolving, even as we speak. If you speak to me in a month from now, my definitions and my perceptions of mental health is might have evolved and shifted as well. But like I said, I just view mental health as this underlying umbrella that supports and is a prism of what we do in every single sense of what I mean by is what we do. Like for example, as I shared earlier, that when you're dealing with relational stress, like myself as an Asian American, family is a huge pillar in my communities and in my life. When I'm dealing with some family drama or illness in the family, I cannot show up to work. Doesn't matter how many systems I have, doesn't matter how many books, mindsets, toolkits I've cultivated over time, doesn't matter my heightened self-discipline from my military days or just my personality type. I just cannot focus on work. What that means is I'm not optimal in how I show up in my work. And by the way, I love what I do because what I do is the process of three different career pivots in the last 7 to 8 years. But even for what I do, I just can't focus on it because of intrusive thoughts, destructive thoughts, because of this stress and burden of dealing with family in the background of my mind. Like, how many of us can relate with these situations? You can insert and replace family with anything else that you care about. It's going to distract you because our humans, contrary to popular belief, we're not logical animals. We're relational and we're emotional animals. And that is a fact. So that's how I view what mental health is it's almost like the runway for airplanes. And for anything to take off from this runway, you need the road to be established. Without the road, doesn't matter how well built, how big and powerful the engines of these airplanes are, the airplane just cannot take off. And of course, that's a metaphor. But I view that to do anything that we want to do as an athlete, as a high performer, as whatever, you need to make sure that your incongruences with your mental health and your emotional health are minimum. You have to address your incongruences and you have to address your mental health stresses and situations and challenges. Otherwise, they're going to spill over time, and which directly impacts how you want to show up day to day.
Oh, yeah, I fully agree. And do you have any words of wisdom on how somebody could get started addressing their mental health if they're really struggling with their mental health? It's impacting their physical health, their lives, their jobs, their relationships. Do you have anywhere someone can start to address their mental health and try to improve upon it?
Yeah, I view a psychotherapy or coaching or whatever avenues of healing you choose. I think it's just a gateway or an entry point. But I do, at least for me as a therapist, my big intention and hope for all my clients and patients are to gradually become self-regulatory, like regulate their own emotions or self-managing. That's why obviously self-help and personal development is huge. But I think you have to nuance this advice for feedback, right? Because everyone's different. Some people are audio listeners, some people learn by readings. So I just want to ask whoever is listening or interested in seeking help because you are not alone. No one walks this path alone, period. Doesn't matter how unbelievable that may sound. All of us are constantly dealing with our inner demons, and all of us are always constantly struggling in our own rights. Doesn't matter how successful they see from the outside. So that's first, that you are not alone. And please understand that to get far fast, you walk alone, but to get to the farthest, you walk with others, right? So first, identify a path of least resistance. What that means is you're not going to pick up something fancy and big. Like if you've never read in your life, I ask you, oh, here's four great books on mental health, on self-help, on personal development. You're not going to read those books, even if they're written by the best authors, because you don't read. Or if you don't listen to podcasts, I could give you the best podcasts out there on mental health or emotional health, like the Wellness Project, for example. You're not going to listen to it because that's not your path. So I want to individualize this feedback on first identify your path of least resistance. What do you vibe with the most? What do you feel most aligned with? What feels like the most effortless to you? Start there. And then second, look around. Like, can you find me one person in your own life? We call in therapy seeking evidence or seeking facts. Is do you know anyone else that's doing whatever they're doing all by themselves? Most likely not. They probably have a partner, business partners, some sort of a coach, or some sort of a circle of trust they're working with, right? And because no one lives on an island, like even if you're literally living on an island, you're not alone. You still live with a tribe. So those are the two advice I want to begin because, like I said, I don't know the demographics or audiences too well. At the same time, I don't think it's realistic for us to start somewhere huge. You can't really go from 0 to 100, but I think all of us can do this 1% incremental progressions over time. As the author of the Atomic Habits said beautifully, right? 1% better every single day, and over the 1 year, that's 365% better. So aim for progressions and not perfection, because I do feel like a lot of us underestimate the power of incremental gains, but that thing will compound over time. And by the time you looked at it, you're like, wow, I didn't make any major changes, but my life is in a different place. That's because consistency and intentionality and just seeking help and doing what you already feel like you could do, the path of least resistance, that thing really compounds if you're willing to commit to the process.
Oh, great. And I always recommend Atomic Habits. So I'm so glad you brought that up. It really is a great book. It gives so many tips and like you said, starting off small, not starting off huge. It really gives great advice and actionable things that people can get started with. So yeah, thank you for all of that. I think that's super helpful. And to kind of close up, I want to ask you a similar question along the same lines, but a little bit differently. So what words of wisdom can you share with our listeners that want to start living more intentionally? They don't want to take their time for granted. They don't want to take their lives for granted. Do you have anywhere someone can start with living more intentionally?
Yeah, man, that is a vast question. So I think you have to first come in terms with your why. Whether you're religious or you're spiritual, whether you believe in any higher power as I do, like, why do you think you're born into this world? Why do you think that you're here? Because I think the odds of us being born is 100 to 400 trillion, and trillion is 100, like 1,000 billion, and a billion is 1,000 million. So like that chance of odds is like literally miraculous by definition, because miracle means the chance of something happening is nearly impossible. So by that definition, all of us literally being born and being alive is a miracle by definition. So since you were able to break through the odds of this miraculous event of being born, there has to be a reason why you're here. And what is that reason? Why do you do what you do? You briefly talked about a lot of us are stuck in a job that we hate. A lot of us are stuck in a relationship that is not fulfilling or unbalanced. So ask yourself, why are you still in that relationship? Why are you still in that job? We call that Socratic questioning, the Socratic method of asking more why, and just do the sequence and lines of questioning. Because a lot of times, many of us don't really think about these questions day to day, right? Some of us are thinkers on a spectrum, some of us are feelers. So for thinkers, we like to think our way through. So maybe some of us like to think often, which is fine. That comes with overthinking. Some of us are feelers. So what that means is feelings come to us first, and then it takes us a little more delayed response to get to the emotions or the thoughts. So start with why, as cliche as it sounds. I think it's the most powerful question you can ask. And based on this Socratic questioning, this lines of inquiry, I think some clarity may emerge if you're really being radically honest with yourself. Because the truth is, a lot of our maps of realities are outdated. A lot of us don't want to update our maps of reality based on the idiosyncrasies that we used to believe in, based on what our parents taught us, teachers taught us, religions, whatever. And we just uphold and we stay with this confined map. And that doesn't really work because the world and reality is ever changing, ever expansive. So you also have to expand your maps of reality accordingly. That's the only way to survive and navigate this life through. So I think through the question of why, it will get to these more specifics and details of oh, I'm with my partner that I'm deeply unhappy with, and I'm very unfulfilled because I never had a role models with my parents. Maybe their marriage or their relationship was not successful, but I didn't have any of the role models. Oh, maybe I'm stuck in this job that I hate because I'm afraid of change. Because change is difficult, period. At the same time, what is the opportunity cost? What are you missing on life, on potential job opportunities, potential fulfillment? Have you ever felt excited at work? Have you ever saw Monday as a Friday? That's how I feel day to day after my career pivots. Do you know what that feeling is like? You most likely don't. But by taking that step, you have the possibility, like the growth mindset by Carol Dweck. Just because you're not there yet doesn't mean you will never get there. But I think everything has to start with why, because the what and the how are just a byproduct of the why. And once you discern what the power of why is, I think you can really make some small living changes, these incremental steps that we just talked about over time. And once you have that clarity of why, there's a plethora of resources online, whether you want to go into these self-discovery courses that's free on the web everywhere, or listen to more inspirational with more mindsets and habit building podcasts like Wellness Project, the Discover More podcast, or everything that's in between. And then you can really lean into other people's expertise and how they navigate their day to day. Because I really believe in the common humanities and the universality of our human experiences because none of us live alone.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for all of that. I think that this has been so helpful. So, Benoit, thank you so much for being here today. This has been such a great conversation. And I think it's really going to help people that feel stuck, that want to live more intentionally within their values. I think this has been so, so great. And I know that people are going to want to hear more from you. So, can you share where everyone can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also appreciate your thoughtful questions. So, like I said, I'm just a student of life. I have a lot of endless curiosities. And like I said, I believe in the common humanity of all of our experiences being universal. So, if you're interested in some of my esoteric insights, some of my lines of thinking, or some of the world class performers or therapists or psychologists I have on the show, check out Discover More, as in Discover More Insights, More Toolbox, Discover More Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your dosage of podcast. The YouTube has been doing really well. So also check us out if you're a video watcher or a visual learner on YouTube at Discover More Podcast. And I'd love to connect with you offline or answer whatever other questions you may have and share some of my experiences on Instagram at Discover More Podcast. I don't have a TikTok because I chose to not start that process, but that's a different story.
Okay, great. And I'm going to put all those links in the show notes. So everyone go check out Benoit Kim. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for your questions and thank you for having me today.
Benoit, thank you so much for this great conversation. I think it's going to provide a lot of value to our listeners. I know that it did for me because I'll admit I don't always live intentionally and I do go through the motions a lot of the time. And I realize that I do live on autopilot a good amount of the time. So I think living in the present moment, living intentionally is going to be a really important thing for me to implement into my life. And I loved the full body yes, which he talked about means saying yes with your brain, your heart, your gut. So many times I do things that I don't want to do. And when I say no, I feel really guilty. So that's definitely something that I'm working on. Thank you so much for joining me today. And don't forget that every episode of The Wellness Project has an episode page full of details at accordingtodez.com. You can find this episode's information, detailed show notes, and links at accordingtodez.com/118. Make sure you join my mailing list. The link is in the show notes so I can keep you in the know about everything I'm up to. New blogs, new videos, new podcast episodes, new offers, freebies. Again, the link is in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you have a calm and peaceful few weeks. I'll see you then.